Today's date is 10 November 2022, and I am in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and I'm speaking with Leo Dormon.
Correct, sir.
Thank you, sir, for sitting down and talking to us. I appreciate it.
Be glad to.
Yep. If you could just give us a little bit of background on yourself. Where were you born? Where did you grow up, go to school, things like that?
I was born in North Louisiana. I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana. I finished grammar school and high school in Shreveport, Louisiana, and I then went to college at Louisiana Polytechnic Institute in Ruston, Louisiana. 2 years college, and the war came along, and I became 18 years old in July of 1940, I guess. At 18, the recruiting officer for training pilots for the United States Navy came through Shreveport. I went down and applied at 18. They had not been drafting 18s in those days.
Right.
And I passed the preliminary examinations in Shreveport and was later sent to New Orleans for 2-day physical examinations and whatnot, and was sworn in New Orleans on September the 3rd, 1942.
1942, okay.
Yeah, just less than a year after the war started.
Okay. Now you were in the Navy.
I was in the Navy.
Did you have any
joined the Navy as an aviation cadet.
Okay.
I was sent back to the college that I had attended for a civilian pilot training course in civilian clothes, although we were sworn in, had been sworn in at that time. And I finished a 3-month course there flying small airplanes, and was then called to active duty at Athens, Georgia. And I went through the Navy pre-flight school at Athens, and from there I was transferred to preliminary training, and we flew the N2S aircraft.
Okay.
Bi-wing Yellow Peril, we called it. I spent 3 months training there, and then was transferred to Corpus Christi, where I completed basic and advanced flight training there. Upon graduation, November the 3rd, 1943, I was sent to flight instructor for instrument flight training, and I became an instrument flight instructor. Served a year as the instrument instructor, and at that time was transferred to advanced squadron training, where we taught cadets the basics of fighter and bombing and general tactics.
Mm-hmm.
And upon completion of about 2 years duty at Corpus Christi, I was transferred to Jacksonville, Florida, where I entered flight training to fly the Corsair airplane, the F-4U airplane. Completed that course and was then transferred to the Pacific Coast in the U.S. in a replacement group for fighter pilots. And upon being in that squadron for replacement, we ferried airplane. The war ended right about the time I was there, and we ferried airplanes that were being returned from the Pacific at that time. I was then transferred to the Pacific through Hawaii, and was eventually stationed at Kwajalein Island, and a small island adjunct to Kwajalein was Bikini, and we're undergoing the preparation for the Bikini atomic bomb test, the first atomic bomb tested after the war. I was the operations officer for an island, Ebeye, E-B-E-Y-E. This island had no runways, no to land an airplane on a runway. It was stationed there under our supervision, a PBM squadron, which landed only in the water. And the plane, there was a squadron group there that were supply flights for the preparation of the test to be dropped at Bikini, which was about 60 miles north of Ebi. During that time, the atomic bomb to be tested was brought to Kwajalein by a Navy cruiser ship and loaded eventually into the plane Dave's Dream, I believe was the name of the B-29 that was to carry the test bomb. My duties there had both the beaching crew for the aircraft and all the other duties that are for an operations officer.
Right.
Several duties. On the day of the bomb, they evacuated all the people from Kwajalein over to our island, and we had the supervision of a number of people, hundreds, I would say, because the plane that was to carry the bomb was going to take off and fly north to the Bikini test area. It happened that when the plane took off, the wind direction was such that the bombing plane came right over our island. It was kind of funny. They evacuated people from there, and yet we probably were the ones that could have been in danger. Although it went to Ebi, the PBMs took off from the water in the lagoon at Ebi and flew north to Bikini, where the bomb was dropped. The PBMs circled in the cloud, the atomic cloud, for a number of hours, and returned to our post at Ebi. And my beaching crew brought the planes on, put the wheels on the planes in the water, and brought them on shore, towed them up, and we rinsed them down, washed them down thoroughly for any atomic matter that might have been collected while they surveyed the damage for several hours after the bomb exploded.
Can I stop you for a quick second? Why did you decide to join the service?
Well, when I was 5 years old,
Okay.
a small barnstorming pilot came through a small town in Louisiana that I lived in.
Okay.
And they took passengers up. The plane crashed and killed 2 local people that I was aware of. And I just always had a yen to be a flyer. And so I eventually one time went to our local airport in Shreveport, Louisiana, and got in the plane. The pilot took me around the field one time for 50 cents. And I was so lit. I had always thought about airplanes, made models myself and whatnot. So that led to my eventually, as soon as I was able, my great uncle was the doctor that delivered me, and he was in a small town in North Louisiana and did not have the best records. So my birth certificate had been delayed, and I had to wait a month after I became 18 to enlist to learn to fly.
Okay.
And from there on, it's just the various training stations that I've recited to you.
Yeah, just something you always wanted to do.
Always wanted to do it.
Yeah.
And during my flight time in the military, I flew over 30 types of airplanes, and I have over 10,000 pilot hours. I flew from the smallest plane to some of the largest. My last large aircraft to fly was the C-130.
Wow.
Earlier in my career, I had flown fighter planes and had been instructing fighter tactics and whatnot.
Yeah. Do you recall when Pearl Harbor happened? Do you remember that day?
I was in college at Louisiana Tech in Ruston, Louisiana, and we had lunch and had group of us had gone down to the local drugstore to either listen to the radios or the jukeboxes or whatnot. And yes, I very definitely remember it. And at that time, I didn't know the Philippines from Hawaii, I guess. Although I was enrolled in a history class, but we hadn't studied that far yet.
Yeah.
But I was in awe of what had happened. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
It was just didn't believe we were suddenly in the war.
Yeah. But you never were able to go overseas because the war had ended. You could get to whatever.
Well, as I said, I had instructed for
Yeah.
almost 2 years and a half, and no, I did not join a fighter squadron in active duty overseas.
Okay.
I was in a replacement group for F-4U
Yeah.
chance fought aircraft, and I participated during the Korean thing in the Taichin Island evacuations where the Chinese were taking over from the Japanese, and I participated in a number of the Cuban invasion. I participated in when Khrushchev was coming there. I flew missions during that. And also we flew missions during the Dominican Republic, where the dictators were displaced.
Yeah.
I was stationed at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for 2 years, and did several rescue missions and landed. I flew a type plane that landed both in land and sea, and made 2 rescues from open sea landings when I was at Gitmo. And I flew transport planes and operational planes.
Yeah. How does the Navy? Did you apply to be a instructor, or did the Navy just decide that you were a pretty good pilot?
Well, I would like to think that was so. Everyone would like to,
right.
But instrument flying was very young at that time. I mean, it was pretty basic, and I had, on every request for my duty station after I finished instruction, was to be a fighter pilot. And that was my dream, but instead I was sent to flight instruments training school in Atlanta, Georgia, a 3-month course, and then I came back to Beeville, Texas, where I instructed instrument flying for a number of years. By the way, President Senior Bush, George H.W. Bush, had been at Beeville, and he was at Corpus Christi, and he had graduated at almost the time that I entered. It was about March or April, I think, in '43, and he graduated from that and was sent to the Pacific naturally, and I think we all know the story of the president's service during the war. And I had one of my students in my first flying instruction as an instrument pilot was for a rather well-known baseball player by the name of John Sane.
Okay.
And I happened to have him as a student. Now, John was about 4 or 5 years older than I started instructing instruments when I was 19, just turned 19, I guess, about. And so I had John for a student for several of his flights in instrument training. He was coming along at that time, and when he graduated, I think he was retained to and played a little baseball at Corpus Christi.
Okay.
And there used to be a saying, Warren Spahn was there, Spahn and Sane in 2 days' rain. He was a pitcher, of course. You knew he was a pitcher. John was. So, and there were several. I was in class with Tyrone Power. He was taking a course at North Island and Corpus Christi and radar, I believe, and we crossed paths. At one time we lived in the same barracks, and I had several meals in which We were in the dining room together, sometimes at the same table, but not always. I never personally made friends with him, or anything. Of course, we were all in awe of the big movie star. And we didn't want to interrupt him. And he did bring his wife at that time down there, and she came into the mess several times and had meals. So it was a little interlude.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So after World War II, you talk about the Bikini Island with the atomic testing.
Mm-hmm.
So what was your duties for that? What were you doing?
Well, at Ebi, the island where the test was conducted from, and then north to Bikini, my duties as operations officer covered a number of things. I had the fuel farm, which we got our gas from an underground. A ship would come in the harbor there, and they would run underground, under ocean, to the base to give us the fuel for the PBMs that were flying and for all the other rolling stock that was on Ebi. It was a small island, as I said, had no runway, and I could barely get my Jeep out of second gear before I was applying brakes. Right. And I seem to remember it was kind of aimed north and south. The island was kind of north and south. It had been bombed ferociously during the war. The Japanese captured it, and every palm tree, all those South Pacific islands and mid-Pacific islands had palm trees, of course, and those palm trees were completely obliterated, and they were starting to replant them, and the natives had been taken off of Ebi and moved to other islands, of course, and it was many years before they were able to, get back. And also at Bikini, they finally cleared and approved it for habitation again, and I believe that many years later, they brought the natives that had lived on Bikini. They were able to return.
Gotcha.
I believe. But
did you actually witness the atomic bomb?
No, we could not see it. As I said, it was somewhere around, I think, between maybe 60 and 100 miles.
Okay.
I witnessed the preparation. One of the PBM pilots invited me aboard one time, and I flew up to Bikini, and we flew for about an hour up there and circled, and I saw the number of ships. They had, the harbor was loaded with ships. All kind, over 100 ships, I think. We had an aircraft carrier. The Saratoga was sunk there during the bombing, and there were one of the large Japanese battleships, one of the largest. They had them there, but there were over 100 warships, and all these ships were loaded in different compartments with various animals. I know they had hogs and chickens and cattle and horses, I suppose, but a number of animals to see what effect an atomic explosion had on them.
Right.
And that was kind of interesting to know that was occurred. I don't think of any highlights other than that right there.
Okay. So you were also served during the Korean War?
Yes, I was recalled. I had come home from World War II in August and July, no, I beg your pardon, in September of 1946, and re-entered Louisiana Tech College and spent a year and a half there, and then entered Centenary College in Shreveport, Louisiana, which is, by the way, one of the oldest colleges west of the Mississippi, and is still operating, and I'm still an alumni of it and get correspondence from them. I graduated from Byrd High School in Shreveport in 1940, and then went immediately to Louisiana Tech, and I was 16 years old when I graduated went to Tech for 2 years, and then, as I've spoken before, I joined the Navy.
Okay. Tell us about the Korean War.
All right, during the Korean War, again, I was the lucky guy. When I was on the carrier Kearsarge, and we deployed in midsummer. The year was 1953.
Okay.
And we immediately proceeded to Yokosuka, Japan, where there was a headquarters for the carriers, and a number of aircraft carriers were in and out of there, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time. And then we would fly around the southern end of Japan and go up to the over to Korea. Well, on the day that my ship arrived on the line, the war ceasefire. They had gotten a ceasefire signed. Let's see. Well, we flew missions. On the next day, the very next day, we flew missions. Although there was no fighting going on, although there was still combat going on that hadn't received the latest instructions and all. But I flew 2 cruises out there, and both times headquartered in Sasebo, Japan, on the carrier CVA-33 USS Kearsarge. They have a ship now named Kearsarge, and it's a large ship, but it's not an aircraft carrier. The Kearsarge was later dry docked in Bremerton, Washington, and I happened to be out there on a vacation tour, and the ship was there, but it was sold to the Japanese, and the Kearsarge was melted down and became pots and pans, I guess.
Right. Were you a pilot?
Yes, I was a pilot.
What were you flying? What type of aircraft?
I flew F9F5s and F9F6s off carrier Kearsarge for 2 cruises. The F9F5 was a straight-winged aircraft with tip tanks on it, and the F9F6 was a Cougar, and it was a swept-wing jet, and it had flapperons and flapperettes and no external fuel tanks unless they maybe had a drop tank they could put on. But I had over 350 hours in Corsair aircraft, and I probably had 200 or 300 hours in each of the jet fighters, the Cougars and the Panthers. And again, I flew C-118s for a number of years in Transport Squadron, and of course we went worldwide, and I had many, many flights to all parts of the world, except for the Iron Curtain countries. I doubt that I missed very many other parts of the world. I've been as far south as New Zealand and the Pacific, and Rio and the Caribbean and the Atlantic. And as I say, I have time in over 30 different aircraft. Major flights, though, were fighter planes, transport planes, and C-130. I flew preceding the C-130, our squadron had a C-118. They were passenger aircraft used by the airline companies too, mostly on the East Coast, whereas the Constellation, the C-121s, were used on the West Coast. That was the Howard Hughes. The C-121 was his baby, and he also had the Spruce Goose, that huge wooden airplane that he built, and not supposed to, but he did lift it off of the water.
Yeah.
So that was always interesting, But I flew a number of the Constellations myself. I delivered those during my tour in the Ferries Command. I delivered aircraft of a number of different kinds to all over the world. And I've been to a lot of places. Around the Black Sea, Turkey, stationed in Turkey. I've been to Egypt. I've been to the other Mideast countries down there. Little episode one time, I don't know if it's worth telling, but when I landed the country near Egypt, north of Egypt. The memory's a little bit shot here now.
Libya?
But anyhow, I landed the transport plane.
Okay.
It was in, I can't, it's just draw a blank. Small country, has a king for a political leader.
Right.
But anyhow, there was a Russian transport plane there at the same time that I was there in my plane. He had preceded me on the ground, and as he took off, he did a kind of a steep climb takeoff, and so one of the officers of the country asked me. I had been around the Black Sea and had had a full day of flying, and I was kind of low on fuel. Not to refuel there, but I would eventually in Greece. I would be going to Greece next, and this guy asked me. He said, "Can you give us a little demonstration of the C-130?" A C-130 is a turboprop 4-engine airplane with huge props on it. And since I had dispersed all my load throughout the Mideast countries there, he asked me if I couldn't make a little display on takeoff. So the crew and I did, and we did a extremely steep climb, because with an empty C-130 you can really get an angle of attack, and we did that to show off a little bit.
Right.
And we later got word that it was a good show. I think we outclimbed the Russian plane.
Wow.
That day.
Yeah.
Of course, no telling what he might have done later if he'd had a chance.
Tell me, what is it like to take off and land on a carrier?
Well, I landed only on straight deck carriers. Of course, right after my squadron was one of the test groups. They fixed one of the carriers to patrol a straight angle deck, but it was the straight deck. In other words, we played like this was just an angle deck and the island was to the right, but we were on the straight deck. And we did this practice because they were about to start building angle deck carriers.
Right.
But coming around, the Corsair airplane at first had what they call a birdcage cockpit. They didn't have the preformed plexiglass cockpits then, and they also had a low tail wheel on the Corsair. So you have an 16 to 18 foot distance between the pilot's eye and the prop. And so it was a little tricky. And in fact, they decided not to use the Corsair on carriers then because of that. They later modified the F4U and made a longer tail wheel that made it sit up a little higher. And they also managed to get a plexiglass cockpit full view. So it made it a little easier, but when you have 16 or 18 feet of nose going around, it's a little tricky landing Corsairs on straight decks, but was successful, and they later put them on the straight decks and did a nice job. But mostly the Marine Corps had the Corsair when it was configured with the poor visibility.
Yeah.
It's just a nice thrill. You just get a sock in the backside for the catapult shot, and you go in whatever the wind factor is. You naturally, with the carriers on sailing, you have a wind factor. Sometimes it's a higher wind, and sometimes it's almost calm. But they load it with a different shot each time for the takeoff, and so you're hooked up to the hull with the hook on the deck, and it's got what they call a holdback ring, and with enough pressure that holdback ring opens up and you're released. Of course, you have the deck crew member that you salute for a takeoff. When you're ready and you have full power on your plane, you salute, and he then fires, and someone from the side of the deck fires the catapult. And you're going from, depending on the wind factor, you're going from, say, maybe 15 or 20 miles an hour to 110 miles an hour or something like that.
Right.
But it's a rather thrilling ride, and of course, as soon as you clear the deck, you then make a maneuver, a turn, and if several planes are coming, like we flew in 4-plane groups, that's called a division, a 4-plane division. You have the pilot, his wingman, and you have the second section leader and his wingman.
Okay.
And the 4 of you perform the maneuver, whatever you've been assigned. And so after takeoff, you make a fairly sharp turn off the bow of the ship, and the other planes are coming behind you, and they manage to join up. And then the average flight time was between an hour and 20 to an hour and 40 minutes. The flight time for the fighter planes, the jet fighters, was probably a little over an hour and a half. You didn't have much to spare after that. So our flights ran about 1.2 hours or 1.3. Sometimes you made 1.5 hour and a half.
Yeah.
But both the planes, both the F-9, F-5 jet and the Cougar swept wing handled about the same, and their speeds were for takeoff with the cat shot 110, 120 miles, or knots. We used knots. A knot is a little longer than a mile.
Okay.
5,280 feet for a mile, 6,080 and 2/10, I believe, for a knot. And so all Navy planes were calibrated in knots. You know, we had to be different, I guess.
Right.
But it's a thrilling ride, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
And for those that are interested and like to do that thing, that's made for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Any moments that stand out about your time during the Korean War?
Well, we naturally flew over areas that had been damaged, and and in those days when we got to Japan, and everybody that I know of just about went to Japan, bought a camera and a rather expensive Leica or the other camera, and we all took cameras in the cockpit with us naturally. And so I have quite a few pictures of taken on the flight deck, and at times several admirals would come aboard our ship. While I was flying in the Korean War between San Diego and Hawaii, there were 2 movies partially made on my ship. One of them was about the Admiral Hoskin. The story was an admiral that had lost a leg during the war, and he was the booster of jet fighters on carriers.
Right.
And the other was the Kane Mutiny, which is still a film in circulation, and I watch it every once in a while because I have pictures taken during that time.
Yeah.
I met, let's see, 2 movie stars. The big tall fellow. It's funny, Admiral Hoskins was a standard statue man, and the part that was played by him was a 6'2" guy. He's a movie star. I can't call his name right now, but he was a famous star.
Yeah.
And Humphrey Bogart was involved in this one. His wife and young son came aboard and stayed a full day with us, and we were able to observe her as she walked around and was shown the ship.
Yeah.
We were in Hawaii at anchor at that time. And so that was quite interesting. And they played as though the ship was bombed and a cater hole was formed on the deck. But these movie guys have a different way of faking an accident. They can really make it look realistic,
Right.
But one of the tricks of the trade was and I have photos of it. In fact, I've got them. I don't know whether I got them on my cell phone or not. But one of the tricks of the trade was to have all the people on the ship divide into the deck crews that divide in half and go, and then when they were ready to shoot the war scene, they would all run from one side.
Yeah.
Whatever side you were on, you ran to the other side, and it looked like chaos.
Right.
Really. So they do have tricks to the trade out there. But Lauren Bacall was a big special for us to see that his Humphrey's wife. You know, I always have trouble remembering the guy that played the Admiral Hoskins story. But The Bridges of Tokori was also another movie that was made on our ship while it was imported, or during its transport from San Diego to Hawaii.
Okay.
Of course, from then on out, it was combat duty, or I mean, it could have been combat duty, and all the celebrities got off in Hawaii.
Right. So after the Korean War, you were involved. You were a Gitmo.
Yeah.
Also today.
After the Korean War, I went on inactive duty. I came back from Korea. I'm sorry, mistake. Didn't. But let's see. I was at Gitmo for 2 solid years there, and as I said, I made 2 open sea landings and picked up people that had been injured on civilian ships, and had a little article written about them, sometimes in the New York paper. We'd later get a copy of just a little notation that a rescue had been made. But landing in the open water sometimes is kind of tricky, and I was on one of the missions, and darkness overtook us, and we were near an island in the Caribbean down there where they have the natives in different other islands come to this island, and they harvest booby bird eggs. There are bird species called booby birds, and they lay eggs on these islands. Nobody lives on the islands, but people come there and collect these eggs. What they do with them, I don't know. But I was making a rescue one afternoon, and darkness overtook us. We couldn't see the island because there were no lights on it, and we had to make a night takeoff. And I had quite an interesting flight because we used what they call JADO on the aircraft that I was flying, which is amphibious airplane. It lands on both ground and sea.
Okay.
It's a UF. The Navy's designation was UF-1 and -2, and so we made a night takeoff. We couldn't really tell where the island was, and a squall line came in, and we had quite a steady. And there was a doctor. I had brought a doctor on board with me for this rescue, and they tried to transport the wounded seaman from a Norwegian ship. Nordrock was the name of that ship, I think. And they had brought the wounded sailor to our plane, and we were bouncing in the waves so high that we couldn't get him inside the airplane, so the doctor volunteered to get out in a small boat and go to the civilian ship, and it proceeded to Jamaica. This was in the Caribbean, and that ship proceeded to Jamaica, and that was a rescue that completed was successful for them. The doctor was then picked up the next day from Guantanamo. Another thing that was, we had a mission to supply the Marine Corps group that was at Haiti. And while I was at Gitmo, I made many trips back and forth to Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And some of the trips we carried, at that time the dictator was called Papa Doc. His name was Duvalier, the senior. His son later became part-time dictator, but didn't last. They got rid of him. Right. But we took hospital equipment And because Papa Doc had a heart attack down there and was in grave danger, and some of the stuff that I took was hospital equipment for treating heart patients, and whatnot. But I made many trips into Haiti, and it was a city of utmost poverty. I just can't tell you how bad Haiti was, and I believe from what I read, it still is pretty bad.
Yeah.
So that was some of the interesting things. Of course, we had two invasions there when Khrushchev was trying to come into Cuba, and also they overturned the dictator in the other side of the Haiti island. Haiti is divided into two countries, Haiti on one side and the other side. Again, I said the name a minute ago, but it escapes me.
Dominican Republic?
Dominican, right. Let's see. Batista was the dictator in
Cuba.
When I got there in Cuba, and the other one was I can't call his name now. My wife, while we were stationed at Guantanamo, she and some of the ladies got some recreation cruises on ships that could accommodate females. And she went to Dominican Republic, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So one time she had a 2-day trip, went down to the Dominican Republic, stayed 2 days, and then came back. And during that time, the three dictators in the Atlantic Ocean, Batista, Trujillo in Brazil, and Argentina, and let's see, Batista. The three dictators were seated at the table next to them in the restaurant,
Okay.
and my wife and 2 or 3 of the ladies that had made this recreation cruise got to observe them. She didn't speak to them, of course.
Yeah.
But that was kind of interesting that she saw 3 of the world's famous dictators.
Yeah.
I can't think of any.
You were at Gitmo, correct, when Castro took over?
I had the OD duty at Gitmo when Castro took over.
Okay.
And it's a custom in the Navy to write a rhyming entry into the logbook when you're the officer of the day.
Okay.
And so I did that, but Castro had a ship come in. All the ships that need to go into inland cities there go through Guantanamo. It's a, they don't, there are no Cubans there are Cuban employees on the island of Guantanamo, on the island, the southeast corner of Cuba. But where was I going with that? I don't think of what I was going to say now. I'm sorry.
Well, we were talking about Castro
Yeah.
taking over.
Well, one of his boats came. One of his small ships came through, and they fired one gun, by the way, while they were transporting through the harbor there.
Okay.
And Camagüey is the Cuban city that's at the end of the Guantanamo harbor.
Okay.
And Guantanamo consists of 2 airfields. One on main side Guantanamo is called McCalla Field, MCCALLA or KALLA, and the other side is Leeward Point. Leeward Point is the jet training base for all the East Coast fighter and bomber squadrons. They go down to Guantanamo, they land there on Leeward Point, which has a jet runway of probably 10,000 feet.
Okay.
And of course, I was stationed, and I was the assistant operation officer on the main city of there in Gitmo, and let's see, it does get a little hazy at times. But we flew back and forth on both sides of the island. Sometimes when we took supplies to Haiti and other parts of the Caribbean down there, we would there was a full crew stationed over on Leeward Point also. Okay. With the jets, and that's where the jet fighters and other fighter planes come from the States to train and I'm sure. And there's also ship training at Guantanamo. There were in my day 7 different commands at Guantanamo. There was supply and medical and McCullough and Mainside Field and Leeward Point and there were several others that were stationed there. There were 7 different commands. And the Fleet Training Group is a major training command for surface ships at Guantanamo. And that was going on throughout the time I was there. I met many of the surface officers, while there. And of course, they depended on our airplanes, and I was kind of popular there, flying the transport plane back and forth to the United States, because I made probably 2 to 3 trips a month, and it was any pilot that flew one of the transport planes back and forth to the States was pretty popular. The ladies always had a list for you to pick up, and it was. It's how we got things back and forth, because once you got down there, it was kind of hard to get off the island. You had to have almost a special a clearance to go back and forth to the States.
What can you tell me about the day that Castro took over?
Well, one day Batista was in charge, and our transport planes on the main runway at McCullough Field, we bought supplies from Santiago de Cuba, which was where the embassy was, and we supplied the embassy. It would come through Guantanamo Supply and then be flown over to Santiago. And one day I flew over, and we used to get eggs by the cartons, dozens of eggs, and other things that I wouldn't know about. I mean, it'd be stowed in the back of my airplane. I didn't go back there and observe what was being put on. The load master of the plane would take care of that weight and balance problem, because you do have to have a plane that has to be balanced based on the cargo it carries, how far aft or forward it is in the ship, in the cabin. And so one day I go over there, and there's a Batista man there running the airport, and the next day I fly over, and I had a shortwave radio that I could speak to my wife occasionally, and she would listen when I'd make one of those flights. But when I got over there, the bearded people were there, and Castro had taken over. Now, he took over, of course, up in Havana someplace, but, I mean, he had people. They came down out of those mountains around Gitmo. It's mountainous, rather, around Gitmo. And they came down and took over, and there was a lady that was running the air, a lady soldier, Castro's soldier, that was running. She was a nice-looking young lady, but she was boss. And the crew that worked with her, they did we still bought stuff from them. We were friendly with Fidel at first. I mean, for the first year or so, we didn't know which way he was going, but finally it became evident which way he was going. And so we would still pick up our supplies from over there. The one thing we missed, we quit getting at Santiago was one of the places where rum was made, and it was rather famous rum. And of course, they had bars on Guantanamo, just like I could do in every military base. And the rum supplies a lot of them were bought from over there because it was a very good grade of rum, and it's still one of the popular rums. But but mostly, I guess we got mostly fresh fruits and vegetables and eggs, and I don't remember any other particular things. One interesting thing that was when I was stationed at Gitmo is I used to go into Jamaica all the time, and they would capture sea turtles, huge sea turtles, and we would transport those turtles on their. They put them on their back, and we'd put them. We had a C-47 aircraft then that we had that we carried transports in, and those sea turtles would be brought back up to Guantanamo. And in all the messes, the officers' mess, enlisted mess, and whatnot, they would serve turtle. I never partook of the turtle, but used to bring a lot of them there. They were huge. Some of them, maybe 2 feet across or such. But it's a food product that supplied out of the ocean.
Yeah. So Vietnam. What was your involvement with the Vietnam War?
Vietnam, I made any number of trips. For our squadron had been stationed at NAS Norfolk, and we, during the last year or two of the war in Vietnam, we moved our squadron to Moffett Field in California, and I continued to fly. It was just a shorter trip, but we had many transports. There was a stream of airplanes. You could almost say that the stream extended from the U.S. to Okinawa was our main base that we landed in, and I made many trips there, and I flew C-130s then, and then from Okinawa I would go down in country, and I landed at any number of the fields in South Korea, Cam Ranh Bay, and the main base at Saigon, which is, I think they call it Ho Chi Minh City now, I believe it's the name of it. But up and down the east coast of South Korea, of course, were the fields that we occupied. And so I made many trips in and out of that, delivering supplies, and unfortunately bringing back coffins a lot of times. Sometimes we'd have load of coffins, people were always, they hated to do that, hated to see it. We did. But I participated in a little bit of everything except an actual combat fighter plane fight, which I have always regretted because I love fighter tactics.
Yeah. What's the one thing you remember most about your military career?
Well, the fact that they taught me to fly, you might say, which had been a desire of mine all along.
Yeah.
I got to fly many different kinds of airplanes. Today, the pilot will fly 2 airplanes maybe in his entire career. I could name probably 37. I mean, I couldn't name them without a list. Yeah. But I flew over 30 different types of aircraft, from the small, tiny one, Piper Cub as a student, to C-130s, which was the largest one. But of course, I rode in many transport planes because when we would deliver a plane someplace, there might not be one to come back to overhaul, and so we'd have to commercial back. So I got to fly in both military commercial and civilian commercial. So no telling how many hundreds of hours I've flown in that, but I had logged 10,000 or more pilot hours. Yeah. And that was, of course, it was exciting and thrilling, and to get to fly that many different airplanes, there's not many pilots probably now that will ever get to fly that. And pretty soon, I guess there's not even going to be a pilot.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
It sounds like.
Yeah.
So I experienced as much of a thrill as you could do during 3 tours, I mean, 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam.
And some Cold War, too, because you were in Gitmo.
Oh, yeah, Gitmo, Cold War. We were always Cold War, and I supplied many transport flights all around the Middle East to all the Turkey, Egypt. I've just been in just about every place you could think of. All the coast from here to Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. There are many stops on the way that a plane makes. Because the embassies have the C-47, which is the old DC-3 airplane. It's a transport plane, passenger plane,
Right.
and they're mountainous areas down in South America, and the embassies normally had a C-47 airplane assigned to them, and we would take one down, leave it, and bring one back to be repaired, and. So we stopped at, I don't know, probably 6 or 8 way stops on the way to South America. So that, you got to see the countries. We never spent time in country sightseeing or anything.
Yeah.
We'd probably land late in the afternoon, go to bed, get up the next morning, go to the next place. But the C-47 runs along at about 110 knots, It's not a very fast airplane. So we had short stops. They were just, the fact that I was on ships that made movies and saw movie stars, and enjoyed flying the C-130, which is a beautiful, great airplane. They've expanded them now, and they're probably a good bit larger. Stretched them than the ones I flew, but the planes I flew were in 155,000-pound class, so it's a pretty good size. We carried about 68 to 70 fully loaded troops, and I had flights into South Vietnam, that I would take, I'd have a whole company, say maybe 60 or 80 people in the plane, and when we would there was a thing about per diem that came up. It was kind of a funny thing. If you were anywhere near South Vietnam, the crew members got extra pay for being in country,
Okay.
So once, if we could land, if we happened to, you couldn't make this happen. I mean, you had the regular schedule, but if you could land just before midnight, they'd get that day, and then an hour later, they got the next day. Per diem, it's called, and that was just kind of, because they would, if you happened to hit one of those flights, it was getting in around midnight, that was always a big hoorah, They'd come up and thank the pilot.
Right.
That was just one of the little asides that happened.
What's the one thing you'd like people to know who might see this interview about your service?
Well, I think the fact that I carried out every assignment that I had given me, did the best that I could. The other people were doing the best that they could. It's a different life when you're a pilot on active duty for all those years. Exciting, and there's bad times too. I had some engine failures with full load of passengers and have to make an emergency landing. Those are things that nobody knows about things like that. I mean, it's just not much said about it, but if you're flying it, or if you're one of the passengers in the back, you're pretty glad when you get down safely. I had a terrible time one time flying. We always went across the Atlantic, and we landed at in the Azores Islands, and I had an engine failure one time before getting in there, and the weather closed in, and there was crosswind. They had only one long runway under the Azores, and one time the weather closed in, and the crosswind factor was so bad. I had an engine failure, couldn't land at this place, and I had to go down to not the Canary Islands, but it was another island on about 100 miles past, and make an emergency landing down there. And those are the things that are kind of exciting when you're carrying a bunch of people in the back, you know. I just can't give the Navy enough credit for the work that it did during the service, and I'm sure each member of the service thinks that about their unit, but the Navy did a good job during the war. And the other exercises that we had, we were always furnished good equipment, and the people of this country can be proud of the military, definitely.
Yeah. Well, on behalf of the Americans in Wartime Experience, thank you, sir, for sitting down and speaking with us.
I'm very pleased to talk with you, sir.
And thank you mostly for your service.
All
It's
right.
much appreciated. You have quite a career over 4 wars.
A lot of
really.
different phases,
So, yeah.
although no big combat story to tell, but
Well, you have a story, though.
but there's enough stories to go around in my career.
Right. Well, thank you very much, sir. We
Yes.
appreciate it.